There was a man named Elijah, born in the land of Gilead. History portrays him as one of Israel's greatest prophets. Although no words were written exclusively in his honor, his life is nevertheless intertwined with the tumultuous reigns of Ahab and his son Ahaziah, two notable monarchs in the history of Israel. Elijah emerged as a prominent figure in the 9th century, a period full of prophetic expectations. His influence was so profound that centuries later, representatives of the Jewish people asked John the Baptist about his possible identity. They sought to understand whether John could be Elijah, a character whose role was intrinsically linked to God's plan throughout the ages. Elijah's prophesied return before the great and terrible day of the Lord echoed throughout the scriptures, as did his commanding presence on the Mount of Transfiguration alongside Moses and the Lord himself. In this holy place, they discussed the redemptive sacrifice that was to come, as it is written in Malachi 4:5, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord." However, despite his spiritual importance, little is known about Elijah's origin and family. The Bible only tells us that he was from Gilead, and therefore we can assume that his story began in Transjordan. Elijah was a man of remarkable physical stamina, as evidenced by his incredible run at the head of King Ahab's chariot from Mount Carmel to the entrance of Jezreel. This feat demonstrated his exceptional physical condition, consistent with his extraordinary career filled with miracles and mighty deeds. On one memorable occasion, Elijah presented himself dramatically and unexpectedly before King Ahab. The message he brought was powerful. "There will be no rain nor dew in these years except by my word." Thus the prophet asserted that the destiny of the kingdom was entirely linked to the word he spoke. After this bold prediction, Elijah received divine guidance to hide near the Cherith Brook, east of the Jordan, where he experienced supernatural provision with ravens bringing him bread and meat every morning and evening at the Cherith Brook, the exact location of which remained shrouded in mystery and dry under divine decree. It was at this critical moment that Elijah received a new instruction from heaven to go to the territory of Zarephath, in the heart of Sidon, where a widow would be commissioned to support him among the many in need. The choice fell on a widow. Elijah did not ask her to prepare a meal right away. Instead, he made a seemingly unusual request. "Bake me a little cake first and bring it to me, and then make some for yourself and your son." He explained that under divine providence the flour and oil she had would not run out until the drought passed. The story takes us even further back when Elijah arrived in Zarephath. He found this widow with meager supplies of flour and oil on the verge of despair. She understandably doubted the prophet's initial request, fearing that it would lead to her son's death. However, Elijah asked her to trust him with faith. He assured her that God would provide abundantly, and this woman's faith allowed the miracle to happen. The flour and oil continued to flow as drought ravaged the land and the widow's son was spared. The story doesn't end there. In a moment of extreme anguish, the widow's son became seriously ill to the point where he could not breathe. In desperation, her mother accused Elijah, questioning whether he had come to remind her of her sins and thus cause her son's death. Elijah, however, took the boy in his arms and carried him to an upper room where he was staying. He prayed intensely to the Lord, begging for the child's soul to return, and after 3 fervent cries, the Lord heard his plea. The child revived and was returned to the arms of his mother full of life. In an act of recognition of divine intervention, the woman exclaimed to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." This story illustrates the deep faith and direct connection with God that Elijah had, demonstrating that God always honors the trust placed in him. But Elijah's journey was far from over. The climax of his story took him to Mount Carmel, a place where the fate of a nation would be sealed. This epic confrontation is recorded in the first book of Kings, chapter 18. After a period of 3 years, the word of the Lord came again to Elijah, instructing him to stand before Ahab, the king of Israel. God promised to send rain on the dry land. Elijah, obedient to divine command, undertook the mission, while a great famine struck Samaria and Ahab summoned Obadiah, a man who feared God and served in his household. Obadiah deeply feared the Lord, and while Jezebel persecuted and killed the Lord's prophets, he acted with courage. Obadiah hid 50 prophets in a cave, providing them with bread and water to protect them from the queen's wrath. As the situation worsened, Ahab and Obadiah decided to explore the land in search of pasture to keep their cattle alive, preventing the cattle from dying. Ahab went in one direction and Obadiah in another. However, while Obadiah was on his journey, he encountered a surprising encounter. Elijah, the feared and sought-after prophet, appeared before him. Recognizing God's messenger, Obadiah fell to his knees, bowing to him and asking if he was the master Elijah. Elijah, responding calmly, assured Obadiah that he would tell Ahab about their meeting and that he was there. However, Obadiah expressed concern, fearing that by doing so he himself would be killed. He explained that in his youth he feared the Lord and took steps to protect God's prophets from Jezebel by hiding them in a cave and providing for them. Now he was apprehensive, fearing the king's wrath. Elijah's narrative unfolds with increasing tension, setting the stage for the epic challenge on Mount Carmel, where the courage of faith and the power of God would be put to the test in a confrontation that would go down in history with unshakable determination. Elijah confronted King Ahab, who accused him of being a troublemaker in Israel. Elijah, in turn, responded courageously, accusing the king and his family of abandoning the Lord's commandments in favor of idols. Then, Elijah proposed an epic challenge that would change the course of history. He summoned Ahab to gather all the people of Israel on Mount Carmel, including the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who ate at the table of Jezebel, the ruthless queen. The crowd gathered on the mountain, awaiting what was to come. Elijah, in his role as the prophet of the Lord, addressed the people and asked, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." Elijah's words echoed, but the people remained silent, offering no response to this hesitation. Elijah outlined the challenge that would demonstrate who the true God was. He proposed that 2 bulls be chosen, one for the prophets of Baal and the other for himself, the prophet of the Lord. The bulls would be prepared using wood, but without fire. Then, each group would invoke the name of their God, and the God who responded with fire would be recognized as the supreme God. The people agreed to the proposal, and Elijah gave the prophets of Baal the opportunity to go first. They chose the bull, prepared it, and from morning until noon they called on the name of Baal. "O Baal, answer us." But there was no answer, no voice, no divine sign. Watching this scene, Elijah couldn't help but sneer. He mocked the prophets of Baal, suggesting that perhaps their God was distracted on a journey or even asleep and needed to be awakened. The desperation of the prophets led them to cut themselves with knives and spears, causing blood to flow in their frenzied ritual, but still there was no divine response. As the day progressed and despair took hold of the prophets of Baal, silence persisted. No God responded to his call. Elijah intended to show everyone the power of the true God. He gathered the people around him. First, he repaired the broken and neglected altar of the Lord. With 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel, he built a new altar in the name of the Lord. Around the altar, he dug a trench large enough to contain 2 seahs of seeds. Elijah then placed the firewood and the prepared bull on the altar to intensify the challenge. He ordered 4 jars of water to be poured over the burnt offering and the wood, and the people obeyed. Water rushed around the altar, filling the ditch. He repeated the process 3 times so that the water was completely saturated. The altar and the wood, making conventional ignition impossible, it was time for the night sacrifice, and Elijah, with unshakable confidence, approached the altar. He cried out, "O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, make it clear today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant." He continued with fervent supplications for God to manifest his power so that the hearts of the people would turn to him. In answer to this fervent prayer, a miracle occurred. Divine fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and even the water from the ditch. It was an indisputable revelation of the divine. Before this wonder, the people who had previously hesitated prostrated themselves in reverence and exclaimed, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Certainty and trust in God were restored in their hearts. Elijah, fulfilling his role as a prophet, ordered the prophets of Baal to be captured, and none of them escaped. Then Elijah instructed King Ahab to prepare as rain was on the way. The sky turned black with clouds, the wind increased, and heavy rain fell, fulfilling God's promise to send the long-awaited rain to the dry land. When the rain began to fall, Elijah, strengthened by the hand of the Lord, tightened his loins and with supernatural determination ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. It was a moment of triumph and celebration of the faithfulness of the God of Israel, who responded to the cry of his servant and demonstrated his power in a magnificent way. After the miracle on Mount Carmel and the coming rain, news reached Jezebel, the wicked queen, who was furious at what Elijah had done. She swore revenge on him and sent a messenger with a death threat. Frightened, Elijah ran for his life. He left his servant behind and embarked on a long journey through the desert. During this journey, he reached a point of exhaustion and despair. Elijah felt overwhelmed by fear and fatigue to the point of wishing for death. He lay down under a broom and prayed for God to take his life. While Elijah slept under the tree, an angel of the Lord touched him and brought him food and water. The angel encouraged him to eat and drink, as the journey ahead would be long and challenging. Elijah obeyed and, strengthened by divine sustenance, walked for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the meanwhile mountain of God. Jezebel continued her quest for revenge, mistakenly believing that Elijah was dead. On Mount Horeb, Elijah found a cave and spent the night there. God questioned him about his reason for being on the mountain. Elijah expressed his zeal for the Lord and his dismay with the spiritual state of Israel, lamenting how the people abandoned the Lord's covenant, destroyed their altars, and killed their prophets. He saw himself as the only one faithful to the Lord, and now his life was in danger. God, in his infinite mercy, chose to reveal his presence to Elijah in a special way. First, there was a strong wind that destroyed the mountains, but the Lord was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the ground, but the Lord was not in the earthquake either. Then a fire came, but God was not in the fire either. Finally, a still, small voice came, and Elijah knew it was the voice of the Lord. Upon hearing God's voice, Elijah covered his face with his cloak and left the cave. God asked him the same question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah repeated his lament and his zeal for the Lord. Then God gave Elijah clear and important instructions to return and anoint Hazael as king of Syria, Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha as prophet in his place. God also revealed to Elijah that he had reserved 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal, showing that he was not alone in his faithfulness to the Lord. Elijah, now renewed and strengthened by communion with God, was ready to fulfill his mission and continue serving the Lord. His prophet Elijah promptly followed divine instructions and set out to find Elisha. He found Elisha plowing with 12 pairs of oxen. Elijah threw his cloak over Elisha, symbolizing the divine call. Elisha immediately left the oxen and ran to ask permission to say goodbye to his parents before following Elijah. Elijah replied that he could do so and then follow Elijah. Elisha demonstrated his commitment by killing the oxen and offering their meat to the people as a final gesture before joining Elijah as his servant. He was willing to leave his previous life behind and follow the divine calling with determination. While in Damascus, King Ben-Hadad of Syria was ill. He sent Hazael to find the prophet Elisha and asked him to ask the Lord about his recovery. He brought a generous gift and asked Elisha the question. The prophet replied that God had shown him that Ben-Hadad would die. However, Elisha looked at Hazael closely and then began to cry. Perplexed, Hazael asked why Elisha was crying. The prophet replied that he was crying because he knew the harm Hazael would do to the children of Israel. He predicted that Hazael would set fire to their fortresses, kill their young men with the sword, destroy their children, and tear apart their pregnant women. Surprised by these words, Hazael questioned how he, a mere servant, could carry on after such a terrible act. Elisha then revealed that the Lord had shown him that Hazael would become king of Syria. Hazael returned to King Ben-Hadad and, the next day, murdered the king, taking the throne of Syria. Thus, God's prophecies began to come true, with Elisha anointing Hazael as king and Jehu as king of Israel, while Elisha prepared to take on the role of prophet in Elijah's place. These events marked a significant change in the history of Israel and Syria. Naboth, a Jew from Jezreel, owned a vineyard near the palace of Ahab, the king of Samaria. Ahab expressed a desire to acquire Naboth's vineyard, offering money or a better vineyard in exchange. However, Naboth refused, citing that the vineyard was an inheritance from his parents and he was not willing to sell it. This left Ahab deeply displeased and sad. His wife, Jezebel, sensing her husband's sadness, devised a plan to obtain Naboth's vineyard. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with her royal seal, and sent them to the elders and nobles of the city where Naboth lived. In her letters, Jezebel instructed that a fast be proclaimed and that Naboth be given a place of honor. Two scoundrels were instructed to accuse him of blasphemy against God and the king. Naboth was then stoned to death following the false accusations. When Jezebel informed Ahab that Naboth was dead, he promptly took possession of Naboth's vineyard. However, the Lord sent a message to Elijah instructing him to confront Ahab in Naboth's vineyard. Elijah approached Ahab and uttered a prophecy announcing divine condemnation on the king. Ahab would be punished for his role in Naboth's death and for engaging in wicked practices. Ahab's descendants would be exterminated, just as happened with Jeroboam and Barah, due to God's provocation and Jezebel's influence. Furthermore, the Lord proclaimed that dogs would eat Jezebel on the walls of Jezreel and the birds of the air would devour those who died in the field. When Ahab heard Elijah's words, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, fasted, and mourned. Elijah's message indicated the severe punishment that would fall on Ahab and his family for the sins they committed against God and the people of Israel. After the events surrounding Naboth's vineyard, Ahab showed remorse for his involvement in Naboth's death, and the Lord postponed Elijah's previously announced punishment. However, Ahab's reign continued to be marked by his sins and idolatry in Israel. After Ahab's death, his son Ahaziah ascended the throne of Israel. King Ahaziah, after suffering a serious injury, sent messengers to consult the god Baal-zebub, the god of error, about his chances of recovery. However, Elijah intercepted these messengers and told them that King Ahaziah would die because of his disobedience to God. Elijah, however, sent the messengers back with the message that King Ahaziah would not recover. King Ahaziah, recognizing Elijah from the description given by the messengers, sent a captain with 50 men to arrest the prophet. When this group of soldiers found Elijah, the captain ordered him to go down to the king's command. Elijah responded by calling down fire from heaven, which consumed the captain and his 50 men. The king sent a second group of 50 men with the same order, and once again Elijah called down fire from heaven, consuming the captain and his men. Finally, the king sent a third group, but this captain begged for his life and Elijah accompanied them safely. The prophet Elijah predicted that King Ahaziah would not recover from his wound, and this happened. Ahaziah died according to Elijah's word, and Jeroboam succeeded him as king of Israel. When it was time for Elijah to be taken to heaven, he and Elisha were busy traveling between the prophetic schools in Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho. Elijah asked Elisha to stay in Gilgal and then in Bethel, but Elisha swore that she would not leave him. The children of the prophets and Elijah were aware that the Lord would take Elijah away after leaving Jericho. Upon leaving Jericho, the two prophets miraculously crossed the Jordan River. Elijah struck the waters with his cloak and they parted to provide passage. He then asked Elisha what he would like as a final favor. Elisha requested a double portion of his master's spirit, and Elijah agreed to grant it if Elisha would see him when he departed. Suddenly a fiery chariot and horses separated them, and a whirlwind carried Elijah away as Elisha watched and cried out, saying, "My father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen." Elisha picked up the mantle of his master who had fallen, crossed the Jordan, and went to Jericho, where the sons of the prophets recognized that the spirit of Elijah rested on Elisha, as recorded in 2 Kings chapter 2, 1-15. Then when the sons of the prophets who were in Jericho saw him, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests upon Elisha," and they came to meet him and bowed themselves to the ground before him. The sons of the prophets in Jericho came to meet him. Elisha bowed before them and persisted in seeking Elijah reluctantly. Elisha agreed to send 50 men in search of Elijah, but they returned without success. When Joe became king, he used Elijah's prophecy about the destruction of the house of Ahab to justify the annihilation of all of Ahab's relatives, as recorded in 1 Kings 21:21. "Behold, I will bring evil upon you, and I will take away your posterity, and I will eliminate from Ahab he who pisses against the wall." Joe killed all the remaining members of Ahab's house in Jezreel, including their leaders, priests, and close acquaintances. So he left and went to Samaria, where he found the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah, who were captured and killed. Afterwards, Joe found Jonadab, son of Arabi, and invited him to join him. They shared his zeal for the Lord, and Joe took him in his carriage. Upon arriving in Samaria, Joe continued to fulfill the will of the Lord, eliminating all of Ahab's remnants, according to the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. When Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, erected idolatrous altars and turned Judah away from God, Elijah sent him a prophetic letter warning him of the impending disaster that would befall the nation due to their apostasy, as recorded in 2 Chronicles 21:12. Elijah's letter said, "Says the Lord, the God of David your father, because you have not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, nor in the ways of Asa king of Judah." Elijah's life was marked by the conflict between the worship of the Lord and the religion of Baal. During his time, many in Israel worshiped Baal, with Melkart being the most prominent deity in Tyre. Ahab, the king of Israel, married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of Tyre and Sidon, and she persecuted the prophets of the Lord, promoting Baal worship in Israel. The drought that occurred during Elijah's ministry demonstrated the impotence of Baal as a supposed deity of nature, while Elijah, through divine providence, showed God's ability to care for his people, even in the midst of this crisis. The confrontation on Mount Carmel led to a national decision in Israel, and Elijah's subsequent escape took him to the site of an earlier revelation on Mount Horeb. The meeting between Ahaziah and Elijah demonstrated that there was a God in Israel superior to Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. Throughout his life, Elijah was a man of God, a prophet, and a spokesman for the true God, testifying to the power of the one true God. Later in the scriptures, Elijah is mentioned in Malachi 45, where it is prophesied that he will return before the day of the Lord, a prophecy that has fulfillment both in the New Testament and in the future. The angel of the Lord also announced to Zechariah that John the Baptist, his son, would go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, with the mission of transforming hearts and reconciling parents and children, preparing a people ready for the Lord, as stated in Luke 1:17. Despite John's denial that he was Elijah, Jesus referred to him as the coming Elijah in John 1:21-25. When asked if he was Elijah, John replied that he was neither Elijah nor the prophet, but the voice of one crying in the wilderness, making the path of the Lord straight, quoting the words of the prophet Isaiah. During his ministry, Jesus referred to Elijah's reception by the widow of Zarephath and the lack of faith in Israel as examples. Elijah also appeared in the Transfiguration scene, where he and Moses talked with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter suggested making 3 tents, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. There was also a time when Jesus, while on the cross, cried out to God with the words, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which are interpreted as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of the spectators mistook these words for a reference to Elijah, suggesting that Elijah might come to save him. Paul, in defending the principle of a remnant in Israel, referred to the 7,000 faithful worshippers of Elijah's time, showing unwavering devotion to the Lord. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, but he prayed fervently and God answered his prayers, as recorded in James 5 verses 17 to 18. In addition to being an enthusiastic religious leader, Elijah was also a devoted patriot, and his zealous service to God was tempered by a genuine concern for the nation of Israel. He was an example of faith, courage, and understanding the power of prayer in his journey of serving God and his people. May Elijah's story inspire you to persevere in fervent prayer and never back down in the face of adversity. May we be like the faithful 7,000 and be a remnant who seek to live according to God's will in our lives. Always remember, just like Elijah, with faith and prayer, we can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and witness the power of God in our lives. May Elijah's story be a source of encouragement to all of us as we continue our journey of faith and service to God. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you all.